My dad was diagnosed with diabetes this year, and almost every day he asks, "Can I have XYZ food?" Sometimes it's cheese, sometimes it's yogurt, and sometimes it's deli meat. Now, my dad's story isn't unique. He's a middle aged guy with a history of smoking and drinking, high cholesterol, hypertension, and a classic standard American diet. He sits most of the day, skips breakfast, and snacks on processed foods. When he told me that his doctor said, "You have diabetes," I wasn't all that shocked. And if you work in adult medicine, I'm betting you're not shocked either. I probably just described 75% of your patients. I'm Colleen, a PA, dietitian, and your nutrition mentor. Welcome to the Exam Room Nutrition Podcast, your guide to giving better nutrition advice. Feeling like you don't know what you can eat must be so frustrating for patients. It's no wonder they go back to old habits and stick with what they know. It's safe, it's comfortable, and it's easy. But here's the hard truth. Without real changes, their health will not improve. So what do you say when your patient looks at you and asks, "Is it okay for me to have this?" In today's episode, I'm sitting down with Joyce, a dietitian and author who's made it her mission to simplify education for patients with diabetes. Her new book, Think Like a Dietitian, a nutrition counseling starter kit, is packed with actionable tips and visual tools to help patients understand exactly how to build balanced, sustainable meals. And today we're going to unpack the diabetes plate method, why it works, why it sticks, and how you can start using it with your patients today. Joyce is also sharing her top strategies for addressing patient pain points, like how to navigate snacks, breakfast, and portion sizes without overwhelming them. So if you're ready to make nutrition advice more practical, more actionable, and more empowering for your patients, you are in the right place. Get settled, grab your coffee, and enjoy my conversation with Joyce. Well, hey there, Joyce. I am so excited to have this conversation with you. Thank you so much for coming on to my podcast. Welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you for having me, Colleen. I'm a big fan. I love everything that you're doing for the field of dietetics, for nutrition, and I'm so excited to be here today.
Well, I feel like we're so aligned on so many things. And when we connected on LinkedIn, I heard about your book. And so really we're going to base our conversation on your book, which is titled Think Like a Dietitian, a Nutrition Counseling Starter Kit. And I have a copy myself. I have read it. It's fantastic. It is so helpful for dietitians, but also for my audience of clinicians. And really that's the premise behind my podcast, is to help providers give nutrition counseling and education that's actually effective and helpful. So I'm so excited to have you on to share your wisdom in this area. And we will share more about the book and where you guys can purchase it, because every clinician should have this on their shelves. But before we dig into the topics found in that book, Joyce, tell me, why did you write this book? What was your goal behind it?
This book has been years in the making. When I interact with my students and interns who are rotating through our program, I can see in their faces how nervous they are in interacting with patients for the first time. And I think every day about when I started out and that learning curve, right? And I remember when I started, I was ready to get into my internship rotations, and I took out my motivational interviewing book and I tried to memorize some open-ended questions. And I had the intention of getting in there and really like making eye contact and all of those things that we learn. And then the unexpected happens. They turn around and they start asking you questions back. And then that's where I noticed that's where the real learning curve was, and being prepared for those questions. And at first, I kind of felt like a bumbling fool, to be honest, because the questions they ask, they are very practical in nature. They're very everyday questions. Well, what are healthy snacks? Or what can I have for breakfast? And as dietitians, we know these answers. We probably follow these guidelines, and you would think that that's an easy answer. But in your mind, you're also going through the thought of, well, how do I present this information in a way that's not going to be offensive? Or, well, I don't know what the patient actually really likes. So what are the examples I'm going to give them that's not just examples that I, with my dietitian taste buds, enjoy, right? And over time, I noticed that there were certain questions that people ask over and over again. And there were certain behaviors and eating patterns that people reported over and over again. And then as I started to collect that information, then I was able to produce the materials to help me present and talk through that information. And so as I now started to anticipate these questions, I was able to develop tools to help me to present the information, to provide them with deliverables that they can walk away with and remember later, right? Because they have to remember that when they're sitting with us in an hour, if they have an hour with us, dietitians are fortunate in that way. They're only going to remember one or two key things. And so having pulled all this information together, eventually I wanted to put it into a book and share that information. The reality is I say years in the making. This goes back probably 30 years to when I was an English major as my undergrad. And probably every English major's dream is to write a book. So finally I did it. Bucket list checked. And here we are.
Well, congratulations to you. It's an outstanding resource, and what a labor of love this was, because it is full of information. So we'll talk more about how you guys can purchase this. But what I really love what you do in the book is you go through a few different medical conditions, which are really common ones that we see in the clinic often. But you break it up into what you need to know as the clinician, what patients want to know, and you give us a lot of questions and common questions that the patients are asking, and then what patients need to know, which is kind of the information or the education that we feel like they should know in order to help thrive with their condition and maybe even resolve this condition. So I really love how you break up this book. And that's what I want to do for today's episode, is go through some of these common conditions. And the fact that you're a diabetes care and education specialist is just so helpful for my listeners. So we're going to walk through a few conditions, and I would just love to hear what are some of the best ways that we can educate our patients. So the first one that I wanted to talk about is some suggestions that a clinician can offer to a patient who is pre-diabetic. Because what we often do is, oh, your A1C is borderline, and we slap on that diagnosis of pre-diabetic. And usually clinicians, if they even get this far and have this much time, will say, you got to cut back on carbs and we'll recheck it in 6 months. Have a great day. And that really is not equipping for the patient. And they can go down a rabbit hole on Google about cutting back on carbs. So I would love for you to give my clinicians really actionable, tangible tips that are much more helpful and effective than just saying cut back on carbs and don't have sweets.
All right. Yes. And I realize that as dietitians, we are really spoiled because we often have 60 minutes, 30 minutes, but often 60 minutes with a first visit to really go through a full education. And I realize that the doctors I work with and other health professionals don't have that liberty or that luxury of time. So I do appreciate that. I would say, honestly, it can take 2 minutes to do two things. One, I think the plate method is one of the most user-friendly ways of talking about balanced meal planning in a way that can address many, many different health concerns. The plate method, as many of your listeners I'm sure are already familiar with, it suggests that half of the plate is filled with non-starchy vegetables, a quarter of the plate with a lean protein or a plant-based protein, and the other quarter of the plate would be the carbohydrate, whether high fiber starch choices or fruit, those kind of carbs. What I really like about the plate method is that it ticks off all of the boxes in what we consider and what many people believe healthy eating to be. It's high in plant foods. In that plate method, 3/4 of the plate are plant foods. It is lower in carb. That quarter of the plate, it generally is around 30 grams of carbs. And if you were really to map out the numbers or calculate out the numbers like a dietitian would, it really turns out to be less than 40% of the total calories, which is the definition of a low carb diet. And it does emphasize the importance of protein. So many times when people are putting their meals together, they're either being so careful or they don't understand the importance of all of the different food groups, or whatever the reason may be. They may either overdo or underdo, right, their portions of protein. And the plate method really is just very user-friendly. It's visual for visual learners. And I think that can take 1 minute to explain. And then in the second minute, got to say it, refer to your registered dietitian, because then they can expand on that and they can explain how the plate method can represent a DASH diet. It can represent a Mediterranean style diet. And these higher intakes of plant foods are going to address insulin resistance, diabetes, risk for diabetes, blood sugar management, cholesterol, blood pressure, right? All of the above. And all of those things are related. And what we do for one condition often is going to benefit the other conditions because they do all go hand in hand. And so there's much more overlap in the nutrition recommendations than there is conflict. And that is a big complaint that patients have, is they feel like they're cheering many different things. And in fact, we're really saying a lot of the same things.
Yeah. And I want to get into that because oftentimes you're not just dealing with a patient who has hypertension in isolation. You're not dealing with someone who has high cholesterol in isolation. It is usually a cluster of a few different conditions. And even as the provider, it can feel a little bit confusing when you're like, oh, well, I have this patient who has high blood pressure, they have high cholesterol, they have fatty liver, and they are now a diabetic. Like, where do I even go with my nutrition education? So let's talk about those patients. I want to kind of break them up a little bit. So for a patient who has diabetes and hypertension, what key things and foods should that provider focus on?
Well, among all of the different dietary recommendations, there is that one dietary pattern that we all hear about every day, right? That is the Mediterranean style diet that has obviously been shown to be very protective of the heart. For people who may not be familiar with the details of it, it is very plant forward, lean proteins, high in fiber, minimally processed foods, minimal added sugars, with that very specific component of including a moderate amount of those healthy fats like olive oil, like walnuts, all of the above in terms of healthy fats. So the Mediterranean diet does come up when we talk about diabetes, obviously heart disease. And then if you think about blood pressure and the DASH diet has often been described as the American version of the Mediterranean style diet, right? Also very high in plant foods, also emphasizing lean proteins, higher in fiber. One characteristic of that particularly stands out is the inclusion of 2 to 3 servings of low fat dairy, right? For the effect of the calcium and also a good source of potassium that help with blood pressure. So again, with that plate method, it can represent all of those different dietary patterns and address those multiple conditions.
What I really want to kind of drive home here is that you don't have to give different nutrition recommendations for different conditions, right? Like if you follow that plate method or even like a Mediterranean style of eating, you're going to tick all the boxes off that a patient with diabetes, hypertension, fatty liver needs to follow and address. And that really sounds like it is plant forward, lean proteins, smaller amounts of carbohydrates. And really, if you focus on those things, you're going to be correcting all those different conditions. So you as a provider don't feel so overwhelmed and the patient doesn't feel confused. So I really like how simple you make that out to be for the patients. Now, can we talk a little bit on specifics of like snacks and sweets and sugary beverages? Do you incorporate that in your education for patients, especially with diabetes?
Absolutely, absolutely. So I guess when we look at all of those different nutrition recommendations, they all do emphasize, and any popular diet out there does the same thing, right? They really minimize and caution against excessive intake of added sugars, sweets, ultra processed foods. All of them will recommend that. And if we think about how popular diets really impact how people think and feel about food, often popular diets are much, much more extreme than what we as clinicians are recommending to our patients. And that's a lot of the reason why people feel very overwhelmed and very frustrated with nutrition and can't maintain a lot of these, what they hear is healthy eating, because those approaches are often so restrictive. So with our approaches in healthcare, we understand that it's not what we do some of the time that is affecting our overall health, right? If we have a slice of pizza, we're not going to have a heart attack. It is what we do most of the time. It is the majority of our eating pattern. I'm sure many people, many dietitians are refer to the 80-20 rule or the 75-25 rule, where again, it's what you do most of the time that affects your health, not the occasional indulgences, but absolutely just like anyone, just like for people with and without chronic disease, we can enjoy these sweets and we can enjoy these treats. It's just that we don't want them to be a major portion of our diet.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point. And it also helps people maintain consistency because when you go on these really restrictive, whatever fad diets that are out there claiming that they're going to cure your medical condition, they're super hard to maintain and it doesn't account for life and things that happen. And there is a holiday every month and there's probably a family birthday party every month that you have. And so that's why I feel like patients jump on and off of the diet train because it's like, oh, I'm following this diet for now. And then in a week, it's a holiday or it's your kid's birthday and you had a piece of cake and then you fell off. And then a week goes by and then you go back on. Whereas I feel that the plate method is just much more realistic or something that they can maintain really long term. Now, is it something that they follow for snacks too? Would that be an appropriate visual, or how do you help them make the best choice when it comes to snacks?
Yeah. So as I go through an education, I do explain because knowledge is power. And I find that people really appreciate this information. And especially with people with diabetes, when you meet them, they've already heard you're supposed to combine protein with carbohydrates. So they've kind of picked up on some of these tips. But I do explain how the fiber in foods, as well as a moderate amount of fat, as well as the protein, does help slow the breakdown of that food in the stomach and enter the bloodstream, slowing the rise in blood sugar. So I do apply that and give different examples of how we might pull from the different food groups for a healthy snack. And in terms of blood sugar, I also talk about the timing of those meals and snacks, where certainly if we're kind of grazing between meals, that can keep blood sugar from coming down and maybe cause it to build up throughout the day. Whereas if we are timing meals and snacks in a way that allows blood sugar to go up and then down again, then those snacks play a really important role in someone's eating pattern for managing blood sugar, because at the same time, we don't want people who are on insulin or other high risk hypoglycemic medications to go too long without eating because they could have dangerously low blood sugar. So snacks do play an important part of the diet, and it's just understanding how to put them together and when they're appropriate. And so many times, I can't tell you how many times I've heard, I'm sure you've heard, that people, as they explain what they're eating throughout the day, they get very nervous about talking about the afternoon and they feel so guilty. They're like, oh, I don't know. I just get so starving in the afternoon. And then I have a snack, and you can just see it on their face that they feel like that's a bad thing. But metabolically, it makes absolute sense. If you have your lunch was at noon, 4 hours later, you're not yet leaving work. And I would expect you're probably going to be hungry. That's just normal metabolism, and understanding that ahead of time, then you can plan to make sure that you have healthy and delicious choices available to you instead of being caught flat-footed and being like, oh no, now I got to go to the vending machine and get a payday bar or whatever that might be. So explaining the role of snacks and the benefits of snacks, I think is beneficial for the patient, because then they don't have to feel so guilty about it when they actually feel that hunger.
Yeah, it's such a good point. I often find that patients will binge eat in the afternoon because they've underfueled or they've restricted so much earlier in the day. Then it's like, no, you're actually hungry. Like if you just
Yeah.
ate a little bit more, you wouldn't feel the need to go for those high sugar, high fat snacks because your body would be nourished. And so it's sort of as a mindset shift of like, you need to eat more in order to eat less later on in the afternoon or the evening and be able to kind of manage and control that binge eating that you're feeling. Well, let's linger here on snacks. What are your like top 3 snacks that you suggest a patient with diabetes has during the day? Like what are some things that a clinician could suggest to their patient?
Absolutely. And I just wanted to circle back to something that you just said about how it is kind of counterintuitive sometimes, the advice we give about eating, where we do encourage people, sometimes they have to eat more. And I have to share this story because it just brought this to mind that early in my career, I once heard a doctor complain that dietitians are often telling their patients to eat more. And I think there's such an important need to clarify that. It's not necessarily that we're telling people to eat more, we're telling people to eat more balance. And that is a very big difference. So I just wanted to tell that story because I thought it was funny. But in terms of some snack ideas, again, keeping in mind fiber, protein, healthy fats, I'm a big fan of things like whole grain crackers and an ounce of cheese, for example, or a handful of nuts and a piece of fruit, or something like that Greek yogurt that's higher in protein, maybe with some berries mixed into a plain yogurt to sweeten it, and even maybe adding in a handful of nuts for a nice crunch and that healthy fat. So again, pulling from the different food groups. Those are just some examples. I realize they're very dietitian-like examples, but they're simple examples. They're basic food groups that I think give a very good example of how do we pull these foods together into a healthy snack.
Those kind of quick recommendations at least get the ball rolling or help the patient think like, oh yeah, okay, I don't like the yogurt and fruit, but I can do crackers and cheese or something like that. And it just teaches them how to pull from the different fruit groups. I think that was really helpful. All right, I want to talk about someone who has had diabetes for a long time and they just are not improving. Their numbers aren't getting better. They may continue to gain, 20, 30 pounds every year. What kind of questions should the clinician be asking them about their diet to actually see what's going on so that we can then tailor our recommendations a little bit better than just saying, hey, you need to lose weight by the next time I see you? What specific things should the clinician be asking that patient?
Well, if the clinician does have time, I find that the typical day or the 24-hour recall is one of the best tools that we have. We learn so much from that dietary recall. But what I use that information for is to truly understand what does the patient believe about nutrition and how do they apply it in their day. And the criticism of a 24-hour recall is people are going to tell you either what they think you want to know, they're going to tell you what they think is healthy, they're going to leave some things out. But in reality, what they are showing you is what do they know and understand and believe. And then that's the information that you draw on to provide information back to them in terms of what is going to resonate and what they're going to be able to apply and what's going to really be relevant to whatever condition they're trying to manage.
What is the best way to ask that question about what did you eat today? What is the best question exactly that a clinician should say?
Yep. So actually in the first part of my book, I do kind of detail that 24-hour or typical day recall. I always start with what time do you start your day? What time do you roll out of bed? And then do you eat soon after getting up or do you wait a while? And then after that first meal, when is the next time you have a meal, snack, or something to drink? And I go through that again. Okay. And then when is the next time you have a meal, snack, or something to drink? When is the next time and it's just like these simple questions. I try to be very careful about using terms like, when do you have breakfast? When do you have lunch? People get real caught up about labels, right? If they don't wake up if they don't wake up till 11, their first meal is at 12. They say, well, I skipped breakfast. Well, you didn't really. Your breakfast is just at 12. So I use the terms first meal, second meal, third meal. I try to really avoid anything that is going to be a triggering label in any way. And then at some point you get to an endpoint and they're like, and that's it. That's my whole day. And from there, you understand their eating pattern or what they believe. And I go through some of these eating patterns in my book as well. Are they the type of person who they're so careful throughout the day? They're watching their calories so closely. They just have a little yogurt at breakfast and then a small salad and a grilled chicken breast at lunch. And then by the evening, they're starving because they were so careful. Or maybe we find out that they eat out a lot. Maybe they're so busy at work, they don't have time to prepare meals and plan ahead. So they're often going out and getting their meals in restaurants. Or maybe we find out that they just generally skip meals because, again, maybe they're so busy or maybe they're not hungry in the morning and for all these various reasons. And once we hear what their eating pattern is, then we can talk specifically about that pattern and how it may be affecting their overall intake, how those choices and patterns are affecting their lab values or whatever it is that they're measuring, and how that cycle continues, and try to brainstorm ways of, okay, how can we break this cycle?
Such a good point about the labels with breakfast, lunch, because even in pediatrics, which is where I'm in, all the teenagers are waking up at like 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And so if you were to say, do you eat breakfast? They all will say no because they don't in their mind, but maybe at 3 they're having cereal. So I love that you label it as a first meal, second meal, third meal, because even for these kids, they're staying up now until 4 o'clock in the morning. They might eat their peanut butter and jelly sandwich at 2 a.m. and that's quote dinner. So it is kind of interesting that the words that you use gives you some different information and kind of directs the patient a little bit better. And I think that a diet recall is so valuable, especially with what you had just said about once you hear kind of the typical things a patient is eating, then you can pick and choose 2 or 3 things that might be somewhat simple for them to change, especially when you're in a quick 10-minute physical. You might hear that they're eating 2 or 3 Starbucks or Dunkin' Donuts coffee drinks and a sweet tea and soda. That's a really quick thing that you can say, hey, it sounds like you're having a lot of excess sugars from these drinks. Do you think maybe you can choose one of them and cut the rest out and have water? Like that's a super simple thing, but you might not recommend that to someone who doesn't drink any of those things, but they're maybe struggling with skipping meals or eating out during lunch because they're busy. So then you can give them more appropriate, actionable tips that would suit their lifestyle and their needs. So I love that recall. And I think that's a really helpful and really good place to end and talk about your book and where people can learn more because you have so many tips in there to equip clinicians with like language and guidance on how you should organize your questions and organize the education that you're providing. So please tell my listeners where they can buy it, where they can learn more about you, and maybe just connect with you on social media.
Absolutely. So my book is available at routledge.com, also available on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and other booksellers. I am active on LinkedIn, so please connect with me. And you can also reach me through my website, platemethodpics.com. It is a stock photography website with all sorts of examples of the plate method that you can easily, again, in a minute, show your patients just to give examples of how easy to apply the plate method can be, as well as some other ready to go materials that you can print off and share with your patients or show to your patients to, again, help your visual learners to learn about balanced meal planning. And in terms of those quick tips like snack ideas, breakfast ideas, and other very commonly asked questions, the book does come with downloadable materials. They're very easily accessible and to share with your patients, and they are very actionable and address a lot of the questions that you're going to hear every day.
Yes, your resources are so helpful. They're so wonderful. So I'm definitely going to link to all of that down in the show notes if you want to learn more and purchase her book. Joyce, thank you so much for your time today. I would love to have you back on, but I hope you have a wonderful day and thanks for being here.
Thank you so much, Colleen.
All right, now it's time for my nutrition notes. So today I want to share a 5-step process to discussing diabetes with your patients. Because honestly, saying, watch your carbs, or just avoid all white foods, or cut back on the sweets isn't going to cut it. And I think you can do better. So I've summarized 5 steps to educating patients newly diagnosed with diabetes. Now, if you're a visual learner, I have also typed this up in a recent blog post. So go ahead and check the show notes for the link to that. And of course, it's completely free. All right. So the 5-step process is assess, educate, ask, present, and collaborate. So let's look at these one by one. Number 1, assess. Find out what your patient already knows. You can ask them, what do you know about diabetes? This respects their knowledge and gives you a baseline for where to go next in the conversation. Number 2, educate. Explain the disease in simple terms. You could say something like this. Diabetes is a condition where your body struggles to manage sugar in your blood, either because it doesn't make enough insulin or you can't use it properly. What you eat directly affects your blood sugar levels, which can impact your energy, mood, and long-term health. Making balanced food choices helps keep your blood sugar steady and prevents complications, and it will help you feel your best. Helping your patient understand how food impacts their blood sugar is key to improving their self-management and overall health outcomes. Number 3, ask. Find out what the patient's diet looks like. I really like how Joyce asks about first, second, and third meal versus asking, what do you have for breakfast, lunch, and dinner? And a quick reminder, don't forget to ask about beverages in this step. I once had a patient who was drinking 1,700 calories and 85 grams of sugar from coffee drinks and sweet tea. So if you don't ask, patients often won't tell. Number 4 is present. Explain the principles of healthy eating for blood sugar control and the different dietary pattern options. You could say something like this. When you have diabetes, your body struggles to use sugar or glucose for energy. Certain foods, especially those high in simple carbohydrates and sugar, can cause blood sugar spikes. This is why some dietary patterns can be very helpful in managing diabetes. Here are a few options to consider. The Mediterranean diet focuses on whole grains, fruits, vegetables, and healthy fats like olive oil and lean proteins. It's also known for its heart-healthy benefits and can help with blood sugar control. Now, the DASH diet stands for Dietary Approaches to Stop Hypertension, and that emphasizes fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and low-fat dairy products. It can help lower blood pressure and improve blood sugar management. The diabetes plate method is a visual approach that uses a divided plate to guide portion control. So half of your plate would be filled with non-starchy vegetables, 1/4 of the plate with a lean protein, and the last quarter with whole grains or starchy vegetables. All of these diet options are rich in fiber, which help you feel fuller for longer and will prevent blood sugar spikes. They also limit saturated fats and simple carbohydrates, which can both contribute to blood sugar problems. So we can discuss which approach might best fit your preferences and lifestyle. Now, because there isn't a single, quote, best diet for diabetes, present a few options and allow your patient to choose the one that sits right with them. And this leads us nicely into step number 5, collaborate. Allow the patient to consider what you said and choose a feasible change. This type of partnership works much better than you just giving them a diet to follow and providing them with a handout at checkout. If choosing a dietary pattern is too overwhelming right now, maybe you can ask your patient, knowing that you need to focus on your nutrition a bit more, what do you think you would like to work on first? Do you want to try to eat more fiber, drink less sugar-sweetened beverages, or maybe have less sweets? Which one sounds good to you? So the next time you're working with someone who has diabetes, think of these 5 steps and you'll be well on your way to giving better nutrition advice. I hope you enjoyed the episode today, and if you did, I would love if you could leave me a review in Apple Podcast. Not only does this let me know someone is listening on the other end of this microphone, it also helps others find my show. I would be deeply grateful. Well, that's all I've got for you today. So as always, let's continue to make our patients healthier, one exam room at a time. I'll see you next time.